6 years ago, I did a course, I don't know if you're aware of it, called MOOC, which is organised by the Tasmanian University, and it's free. Fantastic. And they run these 6 weeks courses, so I've done a couple of those, and they're really fabulous. So I rang them last year, beginning of this year, and asked if somebody could please come and speak to us or run a workshop at this conference. And Kirsty Bennett's name came up, which is absolutely fabulous. Kirsty is actually an architect, and she's an architect who's passionate about designing for older people. Now, I know that she's going to talk to you a little bit about that, so I won't steal her thunder, because I'm much better if you hear from Kirsty. Okay, thank you very much, Kirsty. Yeah, just leave those there, that's fine.
So I just before I start, I can see a question about the handouts. Don't worry, we'll be coming to them a little bit later. So we'll sort that out when we need to. Thank you, Rosemary. It's nice to be here. I'm very much looking forward to talking to you. I'll just put my phone down so I can keep a good eye on the time. Starting with some introductions. So yes, I am an architect, but I did architecture because I'm interested in people. And so that I found out was a little bit unusual, that many architects are only focused on the buildings, and my passion is actually about our interaction with the environment. Although I'm an architect, I'm not only interested in buildings, I'm interested in outside as well. And I've worked in the field of designing for people living with dementia over basically all of my career in lots of different ways, in practice, with an aged care provider, and then most recently with Dementia Training Australia, which was a national design education service, where we went across Australia into residential aged care, talking to the staff in facilities about how they can use the environment to support a person living with dementia. I also know many people who live with dementia and have been a volunteer caregiver both in a facility and at home. And the last thing I was going to just say about myself is I'm currently doing a PhD at Swinburne, and I'm looking at the ways design can encourage people who live in residential aged care to enjoy being outdoors. Because one of the things I found very frustrating in my work with Dementia Training Australia is how internal residential aged care is. And preaching to the converted, we know being outside and interacting with outside is really important. Now, I asked for tables, and we've set it up like this because it was promoted as a workshop, and so while I am going to be certainly talking a bit, it isn't just about me. I'm conscious you'll all have brought knowledge and expertise to the room as well. Some of you will know each other, some won't. So what I'd like to do is just take a very quick couple of minutes. Please introduce yourselves to each other, but also ask what brought you here? Why did you choose this session? And also I'm interested to hear, is there a burning question you have? Because if there is, and I know about it before we start, then hopefully I can try to address it during the talk. So just take a couple of minutes to say hi and introduce yourselves. I don't know why it did that. I just pressed the arrow to go forward to the next slide. And it, is he sitting at the top? Here he is. I just pressed the arrow for the next slide.
Sorry?
I just pressed the arrow for the next slide, but it's gone to a different view. I just thought I'd do that to check it was working. So lovely, thank you. Just 1 minute more. So has everyone had a chance to introduce themselves now? Okay, 1 more minute. Okay, so let's keep going because otherwise our time will get away from us. Ideally, I've spent days doing workshops on designing for people living with dementia, so it would be great to hear from all of you, but that's not possible given the time. What I would like to know is, though, whether you'd be happy just to indicate how many of you know someone who's living with dementia or have worked with someone who is living with dementia. Right. So, and this is a mainstream topic, actually. I don't think it's just you've self-selected. And the other thing I was curious, I know some of the answer from listening in, are there any architects, landscape architects, designers in the room? Okay, great. So that's good to know. Everyone, as I say, will have their expertise. There will be time for questions, but I'm really hoping that you will interact as we go. Have you got a burning question now? Someone at this table just was checking, are we going to be talking about signage? It will come up a little bit. So yes, there is something. I know that I'll write down signage. Any other burning questions or topics you want to make sure are covered? Yes?
I'd like to make sure we cover it from the point of view of a guide, okay?
Yep.
Rather than things like signage are not what guides do, other people do that. But we're guides and we need to know what guides are doing.
Yep. Yep. Hopefully I've got that covered.
Time and finance is always minimal, and so how can we maybe use some of this knowledge for other audiences as well to make the most of the skills that we develop?
Okay.
So maybe people with neurodiverse or
Yeah.
crossover.
A little bit. I can touch on that certainly. Yes, Ryan. Yes. Great, okay. And some of you will have answers for this as well as me. So let's look at what I'm planning to do. So here are the topics that I'm planning to talk of, and you'll see that one of those is about guiding, specifically things that we need to focus on. I'm going to start by looking at the importance of the environment and think about who we are guiding. just as an architect should know who they're designing for, we need to know something about a person living with dementia. And although you've got some experience, I'll just do a brief recap. I want to talk to you about some key design principles, and then we're going to do the table group exercise where I ask you to think about, well, what are most relevant here? So this absolutely is about what's most relevant in the gardens and to you. I've got some thoughts, but I want to hear yours. I'll introduce you to a couple of outdoor tools. So again, you can take away and have a look at those later. And then to think, the last table group activity is to think about guiding and what do we need to focus on. I'll leave you with a couple of indications for resources as well. Most of the images I'm using today are from the gardens here, but I'm not talking specifically about these gardens. I'm going to be talking more generally, but I would expect that as you share your experiences, you're going to be specific. I'm preaching to the converted, but it is important just to say at the beginning that being outside does matter. We know that having that physical as well as visual access to nature is good for our health in so many ways. The other thing I really want to touch on at the beginning that may seem obvious, but I think it's something that we do innately rather than spend time thinking about, and that is how important the environment is, but also how the relationship between environment and behaviour, how we relate to our environment, how we are in conversation with an environment. So, for example, when we look at these three images of an environment, we already are forming expectations about what we might find, what we might do, and how we might behave. And we probably haven't even given a lot of thought to the fact we're doing it, but we are. The environment is giving us a clear message about what's going on and what can we expect. And it's absolutely the same in an outdoor environment. If I go to the MCG or I go to the Oak Lawn, I'm expecting a different thing and I will behave in a different way at the Oak Lawn and at the MCG. So I'd like us just to hold that thought. Remember, we read an environment, we take information from an environment, and we interact with an environment. It can also have a really negative effect as well as a positive effect on a person living with dementia, on all of us actually, but especially on a person living with dementia. And that's why the principles I'm going to talk to you about are important, because we know if we think about how to apply these principles, then the environment can be enabling and life-giving. So, who is the person living with dementia? Who might be the people that we are guiding? And it's not really a trick question, but I would expect that when you look at this image, you realise any one of these people could be the person living with dementia. That's the point. People have the experience of living with dementia as a younger person or an older person. So while there's a lot of focus on older people, because that's the main group, it is not exclusively related to that. There are many forms of dementia. There are many reasons why people live with dementia. So it's important to bear in mind it could be anyone. It's also really important to remember that most people who live with dementia live in the community. And so while we have a big focus, and certainly my experience, because I've worked primarily in residential aged care, we tend to think about that as a place where people living with dementia live. But actually it's not. Most people live with dementia in the community. They could be really fit, they could be doing this talk, or they might be very, very frail and no longer able to eat or dress themselves without assistance. So there's a whole range. Something else that I think is important to highlight is, yeah, we're all different. Again, it's so obvious, but often we then, once someone's living with dementia, we suddenly make them all the same. Instead of recognising just as we're all different sitting around the table now, they too are very different. Something else that I think is important to remember as well is that a person with dementia is not always, as it were, in the same place. So I might have insight into something now, but 5 minutes later I might not have that insight. So you need to always start assuming someone has insight and then work to help them have that insight. rather than starting by assuming that, oh, well, if you're living with dementia, you won't know this, or you won't be able to understand this, or you won't be able to do this. And that's a constant challenge, I think, to us, that we don't make those assumptions. Always start from the highest possible insight and functioning capability, and use your senses to figure out where someone is at. And as I say, bear in mind, just because I could take part 5 minutes ago doesn't mean that in 5 minutes' time when you ask me something, I will be able to do that. So you need to be alert to that. One of the things I think people are most aware of when it comes to a person living with dementia is that they're likely to have reduced short-term memory. And often we hear dementia talked about as memory loss. And what I'd really like to do today is to say it is so much more, and Pamela, if you've done the MOOC, you'll be well aware of that. I think one of the biggest things to me to remember is that it's about having difficulty with complex tasks. So it's about cognitive deficit. So it's about a lack of processing skills. So it's not just, I don't remember where the toilet is, let's say now. I don't remember where the toilet is. The point is, we mightn't remember, but we would think, I'll open that door, I'll see if I can see a sign. Can't see a sign, I'll keep walking a bit further forward. Oh, there it is. I'll look at like, that's actually quite a complex task. And we need to recognise that required a lot of cognition. So it's not just, it's too simple to say, I've forgotten where the toilet is. It's about our ability then to problem solve. And I think that's what's really, the one takeaway. Think about complexity, and we need to figure out how we can minimise complexity, how we can assist people to problem solve, which we do all the time without realising we're problem solving. A person living with dementia may, again, everyone is not the same. Just because this occurs for me doesn't mean it will occur for you. May have reduced visual spatial perception. So that has a big impact on how they read an environment, and I'll talk a bit about that. They might have difficulty with spoken language and written language. So again, already way too many words. I've given way too many words, I've lost them because I've just made it too complex by using too many words. It could be that someone is disoriented with time. So that has an impact again about how long, what's next, what's coming, because I'm not really sure where I'm up to in the day. It could be disorientation with people, that I knew Pamela when I arrived, but now I don't know what I'm doing with this person. That can happen. People can also be a bit apathetic and can be withdrawn. So part of the task again then is to find ways to connect, but also to respect that that is where someone could be at. The reason I'm going to be talking to you about these design principles is because we know that if we think about designing an environment, that these principles I'm going to discuss, it will improve all of these aspects of a person's life, and you can see what they are. And while many of these relate to inside, and the evidence is mainly centred around residential aged care, because that's where most of the research has been done, they're relevant to outside as well, and that's what I want to talk to you about, of course, today. We can also use that well, and apart from improving a number of aspects of people's abilities, we also can reduce a number of things. So that goes back to, that's why the environment matters. Now just, as you can tell, I'm pretty big on the importance of the environment, and I think if we pay more attention to design and how we use the environment, we really can make a difference to everyone's lives. And so I just wanted to return to that and that idea that the environment's giving us a message. So as you look at these two images, which aren't from here, they're from Cruden Farm, the local people may well recognise that. What messages do you think those images could give to someone? What do you see as you look at those two pictures? Does anything jump out?
It might remind someone of a rose that they grew in their garden.
Yes, so it could make a connection, familiar, that with something they're familiar with, yes? That's right. I can't go here.
Nowhere to go.
Nowhere to go.
And the steps lead somewhere, but they didn't have to move.
Yeah, so the steps, but I'm not sure quite how I'm going to get up them, and I'm not sure where they're leading.
Yeah.
Yep. And so,
I'm not sure about the poisonous plant. It's so amazing.
so you may well be right, but I'm not going there. But that is a relevant question to think about plant selection. It is a relevant question. It's just way out of my expertise. Looking though at this example of those images, just opening the gate makes a difference, doesn't it? And that's one of the things I want to say. This doesn't have to be hard. Often we can't change an environment, but we can change how we use it, and we can change how we encourage other people to use it if we're aware of how they may be perceiving the environment. So that if, for example, you had been walking along here, you may, and you could see someone was thinking, what's going on here? We're walking to a locked gate, how are we going to get through? You're able to simply say, and I'll be opening that gate and we'll be heading through. Again, no big deal, just in the conversation, but you've offered that surety. You know what you're doing, it's not a barrier, it's not blocked. And think about which routes to take, and that will come up as well. So here, this path also has some, to my eye, lovely planting, roses and things can pick up on, which is great, but it's flat. Now, I don't want to suggest for a second that we should not be taking any risks and not doing anything. I'm not suggesting that, but just be aware we all have different abilities. So back to spatial perception, someone may have difficulty with the stairs. So you can see just in those really simple examples, the messages we're getting and how they can either be positive or negative, and how we can then respond perhaps differently or use those differently. So I'm now coming, and we're going well for time, which is great. I'm now coming to these key design principles that I'm going just to give you a quick run through. So these are principles that I've worked on with my colleague over many years. You've got some words for them on the table. As I've said, these are mainly being applied in residential aged care, but more and more they're being applied everywhere, and that's where doing this sort of work is really important, because this is how we break down that stereotype and the stigma as to where we need to be thinking about designing for people living with dementia. They're covered in this resource. I mentioned I worked for Dementia Training Australia, and Richard Fleming and I put this resource together with Dementia Training Australia, which has assessment tools and a lot of information about the principles, literature, all sorts of things. So if you'd like to have a look at that, I've brought a couple of copies with me, so please afterwards feel free. I've got a slide with the details because it is also accessible. What I'm going to do is just introduce these to you briefly, and I do mean briefly. Again, if I were talking to staff in residential aged care, typically we'd spend 3 hours just going through the principles. I'm thinking about 10 minutes. So if you think it sounds a bit simple or straightforward, bear in mind I'm just giving you a taster, but also helping you find where you can find out more. And then once we've done that, what I'd like to do is ask you then in your table groups to start to think about which of these principles are most relevant here in the gardens. So what are most relevant to outdoor spaces and guiding in the gardens. I've then got some slides for things that, as a prompt, but I first want you to start thinking about, with these principles, which ones should we be bearing in mind as we are guiding and as we're moving around the gardens. Make sense? Okay. That's the resources as I highlighted to you. They're available from Dementia Training Australia. They're a free download. You'll need to register on the site, but that's all. So the first principle that we're going to talk about is how do we unobtrusively reduce risk. I made the point before, this is not about removing risk. So remember, we all live with risk. We all do things that involve risk. But we need to think about how can we create a safe environment, but in an unobtrusive way. barriers are likely to cause anxiety for a person living with dementia. So if we don't want to go somewhere, we don't show the locked gate, because that's a no and a barrier. We're much better to find a different way that doesn't involve the locked gate. That's a simple example of how we do it. Or we go somewhere where the gate isn't obvious, and then it's unobtrusive. The point is, we do want people to be able to move around. We do need to be designing for people's abilities. This is a principle about living. It is not about taking things away. It's about using design so people can get on, use their abilities and do what they want to do. Another principle is about how we provide a human scale. And so one of the things that's important with that is group size, and another is the size and the scale of a place. Because someone in the size and scale of a place, people can end up feeling a bit lost, typically. So again, think of our group now. You're grouped around tables. So we've made this room smaller, in effect, by bringing you all to the front and gathering you here. If you were dotted around the room, then this room would feel much bigger. So again, interaction between us and our environment. So think about the scale of where we are, remembering people react differently to scale. So, this is a general comment. Group size is important. Again, look at us now. If just one table talks, there's a certain amount of noise and interaction. If 3 tables talk, there's a lot more noise and interaction. It is that simple. The more interaction, the more noise, the more visual stimulation going on, the harder it is for a person living with dementia to process the important things. And we're going to talk about that in another principle. But that's why group size matters. So you need to really think about group size and how you can keep a group smaller rather than larger. So when we say that, maybe 8 people might be a good size. There's no exact science to it, but certainly be aware. It depends how the group functions as well. Be aware group size matters. Another principle is, how do we design so people can see and be seen? So that's called visual access. We have a lot of talk about physical access, so step-free, barrier-free. Visual access is about being able to answer those key questions. Where am I? Where have I come from? What will I find if I head in this direction? And again, remembering my example about problem solving and the toilet. If I can't remember and I can't problem solve, if I can see it, I don't have to. If Rosemary could look through that door and see either a clear sign to the toilet or the door to the toilet, she wouldn't have to be problem solving because the environment has just told her. So that's why this is really important. Now, this is the first part of a principle that looks at a number of aspects of stimulation. So as we think about how do we optimise stimulation, which is our overall goal, we need to optimise stimulation, but we need to reduce the things that are unhelpful. So one of the things that's apparent for a person living with dementia typically, and you may or may not have experienced this with the people you know, the ability to filter sound or to filter stimuli. So, for example, car just drove past before. You kept listening to me. It looked like anyway, you kept listening to me. Whereas a person living with dementia typically will hear those sounds much more equally. So if there's 3 sounds happening at the same time, then it's hard to figure out what to focus on because there's a lot of competing things happening. So again, brain is working so much harder trying to figure out what's the important thing here. Same visually. If I look at a notice board that's got 10 signs, which one is the one that I really need to pay attention to? Whereas if I look at a notice board and there's 1 sign or 2 signs, it's obvious, isn't it? I don't have to work. Again, the environment is making it easy for me to function, easy for me to use my skills. And that's the point. We can design environments for people to be at their best. And that's really what we have to do. It isn't this hard, it isn't so hard, it isn't tricky, but we need to pay attention to doing it. So, minimise the exposure to unhelpful stimuli, and do consider all the senses. So I've talked about sound and sight, but also olfactory. To have many competing smells could be really confusing to someone. So think about that in a broad sense. How do we focus? How do we remove the things that are unhelpful that we don't want someone to focus on? Yeah, did you have a question, Ryan?
I've got an example.
Yeah.
Because we've run, in my previous job, we worked on dementia tours at the Arco.
Yes.
But we tried to avoid having school groups in the same room at the same time.
Yep.
However, we also found that those school groups and those kids wandering around, people with dementia are always segregated and sent away. Whereas actually having them in the same space doing the same thing as the children were doing, it actually created a more positive experience rather than a negative one.
Yep.
And it meant that they weren't separated out. The children were seeing the predominantly older people enjoying responding to works but the older people with dementia were seeing the children responding to works of art. So it was a really positive opportunity for shared learning and shared space.
And that's a great example too of what I was saying. It isn't all one or all the other. And it's about managing that, knowing the noise of the kids could be unhelpful stimulation. So how do we manage that noise? Because there are other positives. You also picked up on that isolation and segregation, and we know with living with dementia, there's a lot of stigma that goes with people living with dementia. So that's why I was so excited when Rosemary asked me about doing the talk, because what you're on about is not guiding, what I'm imagining anyway, is you're not talking about guiding for people living with dementia as a group of people living with dementia. I'm talking about recognising any group you guide may include people living with dementia, which picks up exactly on your point, Ryan, that it's about being part of the whole community. As I said, most people living with dementia are living in the community. And so we need to find ways to make all of the community dementia friendly and inclusive, rather than focusing on a little bit, and if you don't fit into that part, then you just miss out. We do all suffer from stress. So that picks up on an important point. Ryan, you asked as well about, dollars and spending the money, and how can we use the money we might spend to benefit many people. I would strongly, I don't know how else to say it, these principles, while they are about designing for people living with dementia, they're actually just good design. All of us walk into a space and ask ourselves, where do I go, what do I do? We all do that. The environment needs to help a person living with dementia answer those questions, but if it's designed well for them, all of us would benefit from finding the toilet easily. All of us will. So
answers Ryan's question where, how can we use these principles to help others? Because actually we get a lot of people with anxiety, whether they have dementia or not.
Yep.
And so therefore those principles
Yes.
immediately put those people at ease.
Yep. And certainly someone living with autism, again, not my specific field, but I know there's a lot of crossover. So neurodivergence, there's a lot of crossover. So that would be my answer. The other answer I would give when it comes to the money conversations, and there's not time to go into a lot of detail, but it is back to how do we counter cost. So again, what's the point in creating something that a significant proportion of our population can't use and enjoy? I would argue that's a waste of money. So again, good design doesn't have to cost more. It's about thinking about it at the start and giving it priority. But it's also about who is going to use this space. And if we're spending money on designing places, whether they're indoors or outdoors, that a number of people are going to be excluded from, that's not a good investment. That's a cost as well. So just bear that in mind too. Doesn't have to cost a lot of money, but actually to get the most value out of what you spend, include everyone. I'm not going to play this clip just for time, so let's go on to the counter to how do we reduce unhelpful stimulation, we want to optimise helpful stimulation. So again, Ryan, sorry, now I met you, so I know your name. While we're waiting. So Ryan's example with the kids in the art gallery, you see, he identified the unhelpful stimulation and he identified the helpful stimulation. It happens the kids are both. That's where this makes this so interesting, because it isn't just, you know, join the dots. We do need to think about where we are and how to apply these principles, and that's why I wanted to talk to you today about principles, because then you can go away and apply them in settings that you are in with the knowledge and experience that you have and the people that you're guiding and working with. So we need to, I am not for a second either, please, just hear me. I'm not saying let's create boring, bland environments. I want stimulation. It needs to be the best sort of stimulation. We all need stimulation, so that's why this is so important. We need to highlight the things that matter. So when we think about this venue, for example, it doesn't matter to us where the cleaner's cupboard is, does it? That's of no interest to us. But it does matter to us where the toilet is. So things like that, which the entry door matters to us, but probably not every door in the room. There'll be some doors that are more important than others. So that's where you think about, well, what matters? And it might be, remember, we can't change the environment. You might be walking around, but bear in mind, you can explain, you can pick up on that need to highlight things that are important and emphasise the important things in the way you speak and the way you behave. Again, think about all of the senses. Another principle is how do we support movement and engagement, which clearly, you know, these are very much indoor-outdoor things. So we do need to have a well-designed route, and ideally there is option for inside and outside. Great on a day like today when there's a little bit of rain to have some internal options. And think about how do we make, again, free of obstacles, connecting to our first principles about unobtrusively reducing risk. We need points of interest. Again, we all want to be stimulated. You can see how interrelated these things are. We can put them under specific headings, but there's a lot of interaction happening. Familiarity is really important, and while this image is of a woman sitting inside with her flowers and her favourite book, of course it could just as well be sitting outside under a tree with a favourite book. So we need to think about what is familiar. Think about, you know, furniture, finishes, materials, all sorts of things. In this instance, plants, trees, views. What is familiar? Because again, if I can read the environment and it makes sense to me, I'm going to feel much better, aren't I? Slight divergence, but simple example. Who has been into a toilet area, you go to wash your hands and you stand there and you look at the basin and you think, where's the water, where's the tap, how does it work? Is it? Yeah. And so, yeah, that's right. All of it. And how do you feel when that happens? An idiot? Lost? Stupid? Yeah. So imagine if that's how you often feel, because nothing is familiar. You walk in and you're thinking, I don't know what I'm meant to do here. It diminishes us, and there's no need for that.
Without realising you've already done that in one of your slides.
Have I?
You had a garden with roses and traditional planting.
Yes.
And I can assure you the reactions are much more positive in an area with roses and old-fashioned garden plants than in an area with native plants, because you immediately trigger memories of familiarity from
Yes. Yes.
gardens and stuff like that. It really is a big difference.
That
Yeah.
depends on what sort of garden they have.
Yeah.
It does.
Yeah, but most people in that age group
Yeah,
react
but we're
really
talking about
positively to roses
a
and stuff.
age group, so it really depends.
This is part of knowing the audience before they come in.
It's knowing that, and we're going to talk about that when we come to guiding. That's exactly right. Because for some people that will be true, and I've heard that before, and for other people, so the other question, familiarity, I often think of, and my basin and tap example relates to that, is can I recognise what it is? Because that's a bit different from does it have meaning for me? So I could look at a rose and think it does nothing for me, but I know it's a flower. Or I could look at a creative, abstract, well, I think I've got one of them in my slides, plant, and then I'm actually looking, thinking, I don't know what this is. So that's not just about whether I like it or relate to it or not, it's about making sense of it. It's a fine line, but yeah. Another principle, we need to design so people can be alone or with others. That's really important. And so, again, variety of opportunities for people to do that. Connect with the community. That's why guiding is so important, and people coming to gardens is so important. Really key role in helping a person living with dementia keep living their life and being who they are is to keep doing the things they love and interacting and engaging with the wider community. And part of that goes back to focusing on, so what is it that's important to that person living with dementia? What matters to them? What are their hobbies and interests? What do they like to do? And that's right at the start when we think about who are we guiding. We need to find out something about that so that when we're guiding, when we're spending time with people, we're offering the things that are the most important. Oh, I realise I didn't say that. In preparing this talk, I came with my sister and we actually did a guided walk around here with Marley, which was great, just to get a bit of a sense of at least how one guide might do it. And I know there was that question at the beginning, what are you interested in? And so that was fantastic. That very much relates to this. There'll be a number of things I'm talking about that I realise you're doing already. And so in that sense, I'll be reinforcing, yes, this makes sense, please keep doing them, apart from a few things to add. And the other principle that we need to think about too is how do we really afford those people those opportunities to enjoy nature? So think about how we can have inside places in close proximity to outside places, potentially, like what's that connection? How can people maximise their access to the natural world? That's something we really need to think about, and that picks up very much what do people like to do. So now, I've given a pretty quick run through the principles. What I'd like to ask you to think about is, which of those principles do you think are most important when we're guiding at the Botanic Gardens? Now, there's examples of the principles on the table. There's the sheets there to refresh your memory. I'm striking a balance between giving you time, I hope, well, my task is to strike a balance between me giving you some input and you having time to talk, so I need some guidance from you about that. We can spend 5 or 10 minutes. We've got about 15 minutes for this as a whole, but the more time you spend in table groups, the less time there is as a group to look at some examples. My plan is you talk in the table groups, and then I'll pick up some ideas and hear from you, is there anything else we've missed? So why don't we start with that? Which principles do you think are most important when guiding at the Botanic Gardens? Sorry, just to help you simply, I did just bring a short summary. So when you're looking at the principles, don't look at all the detailed words, just the heading and the one-liner. So that's the same on either this small one or on the fuller page. It's the same two headings and one-liner.
old people turn up, I say. Well, there's so much choice.
So just a couple more minutes and then we'll come back as a whole.
But if it's just the groups, I think the problem then just go through it and not come up then to the bigger group.
Because I've now got, I don't know if you looked at my presentation, oh no, it's the USB. So now I've got images of gardens to say, so what do you think about this? So that's, again, it'll be good to hear people's thoughts.
It's really, it's just really interesting to hear how people actually do their job.
Because everyone's different.
Yeah.
Yeah, good, okay.
Is there a group or you're on your own?
When you say that's this?
No, I mean like the design and you know, working in elderly people's homes.
Oh, there's lots of people who do it, but yes, so through dementia training.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And then now I'm back doing more practice, so
Yes. Yeah.
but it's, yes, there's a lot of people in the field, but I don't find it. But it's not hard.
No, it's not.
Yeah, it's not hard.
I don't find it hard at all. You know, I know some.
Yes. Okay, if you could just finish your sentence, please. So having spent a little bit of time thinking about which principles we think are the most important, I've got some slides that are images from these gardens that do illustrate some aspects of the principles or things that might look out for. But before I do that, I just wondered, is there anything from your groups? We're not doing the every group give detailed feedback, again, just in the interest of time, sorry. But is there anything that came up in your group that you would like to share with the whole? And otherwise, of course, I'm going to ask you to chip in as we go through some more slides. We'll use the microphone so people can hear.
Well, one thing that we thought was that if you have a booked group that are of people with dementia and possibly their carers, it would be much easier to design a safe walk and so forth, and you could ask about their interests and whatnot beforehand. But if you've just got a walk for the general public and you've got somebody who comes on that walk, like a husband and wife, and the wife's got dementia or something, then it's more difficult. And you're saying we should suss it out. Now, we can usually suss out various things, but we were like you know, not being able to climb a hill very quickly or difficulty with steps, you can suss that out pretty quickly, but you might have more trouble sussing out dementia. It may not matter, but we're just wondering, like, well, we had an example of what if this person keeps asking the same question? Do you just keep answering it and bore the other members in the group, or what do you do?
So that's a good example of how you how you suss that out, because yes, you're not going to specifically start a group and say, okay, tell me what your issue is, please. That'd be a good start, wouldn't it? And so that's part of it, that you're just alert to those things, to think, not sure. I'm not sure quite what's going on here. But part of that does pick up on what I was saying before. It's about how you respond. So when someone asks you the same question, one response, I'm speaking personally, your guides, you wouldn't do it. Speaking personally, I might well think, for goodness sake, how many times have I said this? And you're not listening. If you stopped looking at your phone, you might have listened. Rather than, okay, perhaps there's another reason for this. So then it's about answering, and then perhaps you can say, you know, maybe, what's your name? Sorry. Susan, as we walk along, perhaps you could talk a bit to Kirsty about that, like invite someone else in the group to have a conversation and give that information, so you're not giving it to the whole group again, or to say, look, I'll fill you in as we keep walking. So those sort of diverging tactics a little bit, just rather than the whole. I'm sure you do that for lots of situations. Yeah.
We had some interesting points, I think. Sorry, is it Joanne? Is it Joanne and Anthea? Oh. Two ladies from Adelaide, Joanne and Anthea, brought up some interesting points. Anthea, first of all, Joanne mentioned that how important, if you have people with a cognitive disability, that you as a guide turn around and actually look at them while you're talking, rather than having your back to them and talking to the plant and describing the plant or what's going on or something about the design, and which is just good communication principles anyway. And then Anthea also mentioned that read the group. Let's say you have got a group of people with 5 with cognitive problems. Read them if they're starting to get tired or a little bit bored or restless. Then finish the group and don't finish the walk, and don't have it also too long.
Thank you, and that's terrific, because there's some things that I've got on my list coming up when we think about impact on guiding. I agree completely, really helpful. I'm going to just keep going. Can I give that back to you? And just have a quick look at some of these images. So again, there's a series of images from here, could be anywhere, but they're from here. So again, which principles, back to that question of things that, which principles we think are going to have the biggest impact on guiding, and how am I framing this in a clear way? Maybe not, sorry. As we've been talking about which principles we think are most important, I can look at all of these images and see the principles in action. And so that's the point of this, to say, so as you've been thinking about principles, how can we improve these settings? So for example, looking at that bottom one, when we think about, so there's a seat, it's around the tree, great idea, but just highlighting, that might not be familiar. Someone might not recognise that that's a seat. There could be a problem with the contrast, because we've got the number of finishes. So unhelpful stimulation, right?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. So some people might find that disorientating and thinking there's a step there.
That's right. So people could find it disorientating. And so again, you can't change the environment, but as a guide, you know that if you suggest to me, oh, Kirsty, perhaps you'd like to sit down over there, and I am hesitating and looking, you quickly think, obviously Kirsty's not reading that this is a seat. I need to do something. So a classic is, I might have a seat too, why don't you come and sit with me? Like, there's lots of ways to do that. So again, you can't necessarily change it, but you can be aware, and this goes back to your antennae, be aware it could be an issue. The stairs, again, stairs are great. People living with dementia are typically very fit, often very fit, but can you see the edges of the stairs?
Not on those stairs, they're not.
No. So,
They're
yeah.
You get a lot of people who are perfectly fit,
Yep.
who will not walk down those stairs because there's a crossing at the bottom.
Right. So again, unobtrusively reducing risk. So we need to think about that. On the one on the right, the shadows. So again, difficulty of perception. Someone who's living with dementia may well see that as a whole. So again, just simply by you walking first, or observing even, now it's very shady here, but let's move to the shade so we get out of the sun, but recognise if someone's hesitating, it could be because they see that as a whole. Similarly with the middle top one, the patterning. Yes, that's right. What could someone be seeing? And the same on the left. I mean, the fern walk is absolutely lovely, I think. But if you look at it with those principal's eyes, just recognise it might not be so easy to interpret. This is a path, this is a seat. So you just need to be aware to help people interpret the environment. Seeing and being seen, supporting movement and engagement. Where do I go? What will I find if I head in this direction? There is a sign, but it's relatively small and it's in the distance. So again, you just need to be aware, as I look down those two paths, not that obvious. Here, again, not that obvious. And it could be a bit daunting because it looks like a black hole. So again, you just need to be aware of that is how someone might perceive that route. And similarly there, see there is a sign. So you can see there's a sign, but it's pretty hard to see. And we, no, it took me a while. And actually, it's, yeah. Whereas if I'm walking along this path, I've got a clear destination, haven't I? So that's what supporting movement and engagement is about how we optimise stimulation. There's a destination. It's also a place to sit. So when we talk about places to be on your own or with others, it's a place to sit. I know that this pavilion, I've just forgotten its name. William Tell. It's stunning, but I wonder, a person with dementia may have trouble with all of those angles. So again, just be aware, back to perception, in encouraging people to use it, just to see how would someone see this, because it looks really great. But whereas this is old and basic, isn't it? So it's sort of more straightforward, it's easier to read. And then another one is about contrast. So just to note, if I wanted to go and sit on that seat, which is a lovely spot to sit, the black and white photo is a good way of highlighting the contrast. So you can see the step is really good, like the curb, it's really good that it's highlighting a step, but just recognise someone might perceive a hole on either side. So just, again, it's great to have the contrast, but recognise contrast can be positive and negative, and we need to be aware this depth perception is a really big thing. And then here comes back to the plants that we're talking about, what's familiar to people. So these were the ones I picked, especially that tree on the right, which is just amazing. But again, is it familiar? So that's not to say it's not brilliant. I'm not saying only show people who are living with dementia familiar things. Everyone wants excitement or stimulation, but recognise someone might not make sense of that as a plant or these enormous leaves as easily as they would something else. So it's more just something you bear in mind, that principle of what is familiar and what can people relate to. Now, I am conscious, again, we can talk for ages about this, so I know I keep saying about being quick, but I'm just conscious I'm racing through, but I don't have that much choice. This Gardens That Care, I've got, again, a copy of that if you want to have a flick through. This is a really good book. It highlights some garden design principles. So what I've spoken to you about are some principles that are absolutely relevant to designing outdoors as well as indoors. These are now honing down more specifically on garden design. And given you're not looking to design a garden, but you're working within a garden, I'm not planning to spend a lot of time, but you can see these are the sorts of things. So see the strong connection between what we've been talking about, socialisation, accessibility, meaningful activity and so on. I've got the reference for that, the last slide I'll leave up so you can see it. That's downloadable from Tara Graham-Cochrane. She's a landscape architect in South Australia, very involved in horticultural therapy. And so Design Well is her practice and you can download it from there. And I've also put copies on the table of the Seniors Outdoor Survey. Now again, we're not going to use it now. The reason it's interesting is that it highlights these key themes that we know are important to, in this case, an older person. So they've done the research both in looking at the literature, talking to older people about what they would like in an outdoor space, and then actually observing what they did use in an outdoor space. And from that, they've come up with these list of things that are important. And I thought it might be of interest to you to have that assessment tool, and you'll see the summary. I just put a couple on each table this morning. There's a summary of the items. Again, when you're thinking what could be of interest, keep these sort of things in mind, that we know it's likely a person will be interested in these sorts of things. So now, I want to come to the last part, which is what things to focus on as we're guiding. Now, we've already been talking about this, but I just really want to hone in on that and finish with that. Again, if we take about 10 minutes to do that in table groups or so, and then that will give a little bit of time for me to do a similar summary, if that sort of sounds like a plan to you people. My suggestion, when you think about how do we focus, what do we need to focus on as guides? So yes, thinking about, we've approached it from a principal's point of view. Now I want you to approach it from, I'm a guide, I'm meeting my group. What am I going to focus on, knowing that in this group there are likely to be some people who are living with dementia? So think, for example, about the beginning, the middle, and the end of the guided walk. Think about what sort of things are you going to pay attention to as you guide, and think about how this could influence your choice of where you go and what you do on the walk. So, having thought about it from a principal's point of view, now absolutely put your guide hat on, imagine your group, and talk about, right, what are we going to focus on, knowing that we have people living with dementia in our group, beginning, middle, end? What's our focus? What sort of things do we want to pay attention to during the walk, but do on the walk? Okay, have a chat. So just a couple more minutes and then we'll come back to the whole group. So if you could start to just finish your sentences and then we'll, because I'm conscious other people are going to start coming in. So maybe if we just come back as a whole, that would be good. So as we think about guiding and what do we need to focus on, you will have all talked about things. These are the things that I thought about and thought it could be good just to close by going through some of these with you. We've still got a little bit of time as far as if you want to add something, please do. So the first thing I think to think about is, well, how many people? Remember that principle of a human scale. How big's the group? How many people are you trying to guide? So think about that in the very first instance and what you can do about it. Then the next big one is, well, where are we going to go? And that's a really big topic and picks up so many of those things. So where are we going to start? Choose a quiet place. For example, here the visitor centre, the day I came, has music playing outside. So to have an introduction and conversation with music playing in the background, remember a person's less able to filter the sound, so it's unhelpful stimulation. So think about where you're going to gather your group and choose a quiet place with few distractions, because remember, visual distractions can be as much as the auditory distractions. As we know, what are people interested in? So try to suss out what is it that people are interested in, and if possible, why they're interested in it, because that might give you another idea as well, that I might be really interested in camellias, but it's not camellia season. But you can then think, oh, well, if she's interested in camellias, she might like, and off you go. So if you can do that, but again, don't put someone on the spot. And remember, a person might not be able to give you an answer straight away, but an answer might come up a bit later. So be open to that as well. It's not a test, it's not a public speaking thing, but be ready to hear that answer a bit later. Think about where are we going? How can we give people a clear sense of direction? That importance of knowing where are we heading? What am I up for? What's about to happen? How can you give that clear sense of direction? Can people return easily? And we talked about that before, about people's ability to keep going, people's need for a rest. So have I got options partway through to think, actually, I think this has been great, people have had enough, we're going to finish soon. And you get them back to a place where they know. So think about where are we going in terms of length of walk, how easy the walk is as well for people's abilities. Now, did ask about signage, and we haven't spoken that in a lot of detail. Signage, it was in some of the examples. The reason I haven't gone into a lot of detail is it's already there. So I think absolutely make the most of the signage that you can. Improving the signage is always great. But if you keep an eye out for the deficits of signage, and think about how the garden can actually give that sense of direction. So we saw some images where there was a clear destination. So think about how actually the environment tells us what we need to know, rather than relying on a sign. And otherwise, you be aware that the signage isn't providing what you think is needed. So you either bring portable things with you yourself, or you're using your voice to reinforce things. What are we focusing on? Well, again, the plant types, features in the garden perhaps, rest spots, and think about the amount of stimulation. I think we need to think about what are our destinations. There might be new places people could go and enjoy. There might be familiar places that they want to see. There might be specific parts of a garden that you think would be really great to go to once you know the group, so be open to that. Think about how we get there. So what's the most simple and direct route? And that's a good way to start, because it then gives options for building in complexity and length and variety once you've sussed out how things are going. So how can we keep this simple, picking up a range of abilities and remembering that idea of being able to make it shorter or longer depending on how people are going. And also recognising that it might be Kirsty's had enough and I've had enough, I want to go. But the other 8 people in the group want to keep doing the walk. So you need to be able to manage that. So that goes back to choosing your route and the clear direction of where you can drop me off so that I'm safe and happy, but keep guiding with everyone else. What information do we give? So we've talked a little bit about that. I suppose, what sort of information? Think about when we give it. Again, don't give bursts of information right at the beginning and expect people to retain it. But also, it's not just about retention, it just becomes overwhelming. That it's sort of, this is too much, I don't understand, I can't take it all in, this isn't for me. Again, someone feels small, rather than being excited, I've come to the Botanic Gardens, isn't this going to be great? Be prepared to repeat information and think about how to do that in a way that's positive for everyone. As I say, where do we give the information? So not only at the beginning, but think about where we give that information in places where people can perhaps see what you're talking about, hear what you're talking about, and not have unhelpful stimulation which can compete with the information you're giving. And then how long will we guide for? And that's something that I'm sure you consider all the time, but it is a question just to see how is the attention span going. And someone might actually want to go for 2 hours and be living with dementia. Again, we're not all the same, but just be aware of that, and that's where the route is important and how we're able to return and leave someone at a good destination is important. These are many things that I think you're already going to be doing. So in that sense, this is reinforcing this really matters and it is important. As I said, often we can't change the environment, but we can change how we use it, and we can change our understanding of how someone else is perceiving the environment and then respond to make it a pleasant and a happy experience for them. I'm conscious that we're up for time. I'll leave you with this slide, which has got some, the references. I've spoken about Gardens That Care. I've spoken about the Dementia Training Australia resources, which are here, and please feel free to come up. I've also got my cards here. If you didn't get a copy of the handouts and would like one, I don't mind if you email me and I'll just send you a PDF so that you've got them if you think that would be helpful. And yeah, I'm not dashing off, so happy to keep chatting. Thank you.
Kirsty, that was just wonderful. Thank you very, very much. It's just really great to I haven't done this MOOC course for about 2 or 3 years, and it's just fantastic to listen to what you've got to say, and it all gels around the garden. So thank you very much, and if you'd like to accept this on our behalf.
Oh, lovely.
Thank you very much.